I would like to extend a warm welcome to Director General Mr. David Yen-So-Lin of the Taipei Liaison Office in Cape Town, our guest speakers Dominic Meng-Hsuan Yang and Agnes Schwao-Ling Yu, trustees of the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center, scholars, and all of you who have signed in from around the world. My name is Heather Blumenthal, and I'm the Executive Director of the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center. For those of you who are not familiar with our center, we were established in 1999 and was the first Holocaust center established on the African continent. We serve as a place of commemoration, memorial, and remembrance to the Jews who were killed in the Holocaust and all victims of Nazi Germany. We also engage in and promote a remembrance of similar suffering by mankind to honor the memory of victims of genocide in the 20th century and teach about the consequences of prejudice, hate speech so as to prevent the recurrence of mass atrocities and genocides in all its forms. As an educational institution, we promote awareness, education, dialogue, and lessons for humanity about the consequences of prejudice, racism, anti-Semitism, bigotry, homophobia, xenophobia, and othering, with an emphasis on human rights issues. With this in mind, on behalf of the Center, I welcome you to the first session of a 4-part discussion forum on the impossibilities of a comparative approach to transitional justice. Usually, events like these start with the Nuremberg trials, then continue to explore how truth commissions were implemented in South America and later in South Africa, and end with how the idea of transitional justice spread across the world after the end of the Cold War. This forum will do the exact opposite. We will start with Taiwan, whose Transitional Justice Commission recently submitted its conclusive report to the government, and we will then go back in history to explore how Taiwanese scholars try to learn lessons from the South African and German experience of dealing with their past. This forum will conclude with a discussion on the possibilities and limitations of such a comparative approach. This 4-part webinar series was researched, organized, and will be moderated by Alexander Novakovic, our intern from the Austrian Service Abroad. Alex is studying Sinology, Modern Chinese Studies at the University of Vienna, and is currently writing his master's thesis on transitional justice in Taiwan. Before I hand over to Alex, I would like to invite our most generous sponsor, Director General Lin, to give us an opening statement.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to say a few words. This is an honor for me to speak on behalf of our government in Taiwan. Let me first express our gratitude to Executive Director Heather Blumenthal of the Cape Town Holocaust and the Genocide Center, and special thanks to Alex Novakovic. Without both of your support and friendship, we will not be able to be here to have today's event. And we all know that Taiwan has a long history of colonization and authoritarian rule. From 1949 to the late 1980s, people in Taiwan were living under martial law. But we are very fortunate to have our first democratization, our first direct presidential election in '96, and Taiwan became a young democracy. In Taiwan, at the dawn of its democracy, under the first democratic leadership, our late President Lee Teng-hui's leadership, he publicly apologized to all the people in Taiwan who are suffered from the pain and the victims that we went on through under the martial law. President Lee promised for transparency and compensation for those people who suffered, and the designation of a memorial day to heal people's spirit and rebuild their dignity. And under the current President Tsai Ing-wen's leadership, and it was the transitional, it was the time that when the transitional justice in Taiwan was first tracked and became more transparent. And the establishment of the ill-gotten party assets settlement committee and Transitional Justice Commission was set up with the hope of bringing more accountability and historic truth to the people of Taiwan. With these commissions came opening political archives, overturning wrongful convictions, and removing authoritarian symbols and preserving unjust sites. I'm sure that with the continued perseverance from our people and government in Taiwan, Taiwan will continue to find the truth on the injustices of the past and continue to give our people a democratic society to live in. Taiwan is now ranked number one in Asia by Democratic Index for World Democracy, and the number 8 globally in 2021 by the Economist Intelligence Index, which was published this year in February. And Taiwan has demonstrated to the world that freedom is a stabilizing force, free enterprise, free association, free speech will lead to entrepreneurship and prosperity and security. Taiwan continues to build a full, inclusive, and free civil society, which translates to a more vibrant and more functioning, a much better functioning and prosperous society. This has already transcended to the international community, where Taiwan is now a beacon of hope and extends helping hands to the rest of the world. As the former US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, underscored, Taiwan is a democratic success story, a reliable partner. Taiwan is a force for good in the world, especially during this period of time that all the people globally are suffering, and Taiwan can help. Taiwan cares. And we will continue to work on the transitional justice for the benefit of our people. I'm sure that we will be able to learn from each other in promoting transitional justice. I look forward to learning from your comments. Thank you for having me here. I wish you a successful event. Thank you.
Thank you, Director General Lin, for this opening remarks, and thank you, Heather, for the kind introduction. So, you know, one of the most difficult aspects of so-called dealing with the past is coping with ambiguity. We encounter ambiguity when our preconceived ideas of right and wrong and good and evil don't seem to fit. And when we realize that history is often not black and white, but appears in many different shades of gray, we somehow need to cope with. Yeah, Taiwan is not an exception from this. Yeah, therefore it is my pleasure to introduce you to two scholars, and I would like them to turn on the camera now, who did not shy away from going beyond the conventional way of explaining things in Taiwan, but actually embarked on this very difficult journey and shed light on some of those gray areas in Taiwanese history, which are now slowly moving into the center of people's attention. I welcome Professor Dominic Young. He is a professor for East Asian history at the University of Missouri and the author of The Great Exodus from China. His research focuses on the memory, trauma, and identity of so-called mainlanders in Taiwan. You're going to hear who they are very soon. A group of people who were conventionally more associated with the perpetrators and being beneficiaries of the dictatorship rather than also being able to be seen as victims. I also warmly welcome Dr. Agnes Xiao. She's currently working in the Taipei city government and wrote her PhD as a critique of the Transitional Justice Scheme in Taiwan, where she conducted interviews with victims of the White Terror, the former dictatorship, and realized that the dominant victimhood narrative that still dominates transitional justice discourse in Taiwan until today is, let's say, not the whole story. They're both going to hold each a 15-minute presentation to provide us with a little bit of context of what's going on in Taiwan and how it got there. Then I am going to have a moderated discussion with them for about 25 minutes. And after the moderated discussion, we open the discussion for public Q&A. Dominic, I would like you to share your presentation now. The stage is yours.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Let me see if I can do this as quickly as I can. So let's see. All right.
Do you want to leave your camera on? Maybe there we go.
So can you guys see the? Let me see. Yep. Thank you very much, Alex, for the kind introduction and for the inspirational speeches given by Director Blumenthal and Director General Lin. Now, as the opening to this session of the current state of transitional justice in Taiwan, in the series of impossibility of a comparative approach to transitional justice, sponsored by the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center, and also by MOFA of Taiwan, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as the person who is going to do the opening. And as a historian, I thought of my job as to sort of provide our audience here with this sort of basic framework, historical background, and also, this sort of general and how we basically got to do transitional justice in Taiwan, following democratization in the late 1980s and the 90s, and also, the why it went down the way that it went, and also some sort of the problems that's actually or inadequacies associated with it. And before I go into my presentation, I would like to say that although as a historian, I am somewhat critical of the TJ process in Taiwan, but that doesn't mean that I think TJ is unnecessary or is quite the contrary. And I think it's necessary for any society that have went through authoritarian dictatorship or colonialism to reflect on its own past wrongs, and also that, and it's one of the most important tasks for society to come to some sort of reckoning and reconciliation of the past. And also, I know that as a relatively junior scholar, for me to sit here and basically, what I'm trying to say is that I'm not here to point fingers, and I'm not here to, sort of denounce the incredible, amount of work that has been done by an interdisciplinary group of scholars and activists, lawyers, human rights lawyers, and including the victims themselves and their family, who have basically fought, for this. They fought for democracy and human rights and justice and social justice before democratization. And today in Taiwan, they're still fighting, for a better society and a better sort of reckoning the past injustices and how to assess responsibility. So I tip my hat to them. They are my heroes, and so here we go. Now, so I only have 15 minutes, so I want to basically go over things quickly, especially the history part. I know the history part is very familiar to audience from Taiwan, but for the benefit of people that are tuning in locally in South Africa, and also from other parts of the world, this background information is, especially the history part, is very important for them to sort of understand the context and the background, and to understand why the issues that I mentioned at the very end of the presentation, the issues that has to do with the characteristics of transitional justice in Taiwan, and why it went down the way that it did, or it has been, that because the history explained the divided memory politics in Taiwan after democratization. So the presentation is going to go for, I divided into 3 different parts. Part 1, history, politics, and memory. Part 2, I will just go over some of the process of Taiwan's transitional justice process from 1992 to 2002, and as Director Lin has just mentioned that, and also Director Blumenthal mentioned that Taiwan's Transitional Justice Commission was formed in 2018, so rather late, and I'll explain a little bit why that it was so late. And then, after 3-4 years of work, it has just been just concluded its task and submitted a rather heavy report. I haven't read the report. I've read some preliminaries of the report before the actual report, but not the final big one that they came up with. And also, at the very end of this presentation, I'll go over some assessments and recommendations. These are my personal assessment and recommendations for Taiwan's TJ. So let's go. Now, I will go over this part really quickly. To talk about Taiwan's history, it has a very, very long history, and a lot of the history that we talked about related to TJ has to do with more recent development, especially 20th century Japanese colonialism, first part of the 20th century, and of course the nationalist rule period from 1945, single party dictatorship period that I meant by that, from 1945 to 1987 or 1992, depends on one's perspective. Now, but I would mention here that it is important to understand different population groups in Taiwan, because that has also a lot to do with our understanding of Taiwan's transitional justice, because a part of that transitional justice is the transitional justice for the indigenous Austronesian communities. And these people are only now 2% of the Taiwanese population, but they're the original residents of the island, right? So they inhabited this island, probably, the history, you can trace it back to the Neolithic age. Now, one thing I would like to mention here, because it used to be that when we talked about Taiwan history, and this history, this particular interpretation I'm talking about, Taiwan's 400 years history, has to really do with this sort of Sino or China-centered history. That means Taiwanese history, Taiwan only has a history because there were migrants from China. And this started in the late 17th century and continued to 19th century, this first wave of mass migration. And they came not all over China, but mainly from regions of China, the southern Fujian province and the northern Guangdong province. And there are two different groups, language groups, Hoklo and Hakka, they're colonial settlers, and they basically just step over the local indigenous Austronesian communities. And so there was a form of settler colonialism, but it was a settler colonialism facilitated by Dutch colonization. Now, here's a very simple, map just to sort of show you, we don't have to go into the different period. Dutch Formosa, Kingdom of Tongjing, that's basically a Chinese pirate king that had established a regime on Taiwan from the mid 17th century to the late 17th century. Then parts of Taiwan was taken over by the Qing dynasty, which ruled Taiwan from 1683 to 1895. Now, again, the most important thing that I want the audience to get from this slide is this debate on Taiwan's 400 history. Does Taiwan has a history that is actually longer than 400 years? Because as part of the Taiwan's transitional justice is about reimagining Taiwan's history, as a way to establish Taiwanese identity and Taiwanese nationalism. Now, and in this rewriting of history, that happened mostly after democratization. That goes with transitional justice. Indigenous people's history or Aboriginal history became very, very important because the Taiwanese were trying to get away from, they try to make a distinction between themselves and China, right? So then the irony is that, although today indigenous people are still suppressed, they are still marginalized. And then we'll talk about it as a part of the problem with Taiwan's transitional justice, because it's focused so much on the nationalist era. White Terror and the 228 massacre, these are like white nationalist era. The second part of the 20th century, eventually a crime against humanities are very, very important for us to look at. But there are other issues in Taiwan that's sort of in Taiwan's teaching process that's somehow sort of marginalized or neglected because of this emphasis on human rights abuse under the nationalist regime. And like I said, I'm not whitewashing the nationalist period. It was a very, very bad period where tens of thousands of people were jailed and thousands were executed, and the nationalists basically constructed the police state. Of course, there is going to be reckoning for that, but then again, the point here is this sort of the difference between the Sinocentric view of history. Taiwan only has 400 years history. This history become important because of Chinese settlers came, or now we're switching up to this sort of multi-ethnic view of Taiwanese history, where Taiwan was an island nation in itself, and Taiwan was subjected to multiple colonial forces of migration, including the ones from China. Now, the Japanese colonial period in Taiwan, which ran from late 19th century to the mid 20th century, is also extremely important for us to understand the divided memory and the different population groups on Taiwan. Because, Taiwan was given away by the Qing dynasty to Imperial Japan because they lost a war, and Taiwan was ceded. It was Japan's first former colony. And so from this 50 years colonialism, we have, Taiwan's population today that has very different divided views of Japan. For people who had very positive views, the Japanese brought colonial modernity. And also the populations on Taiwan, their ancestors or their grandparents' generation actually fought in different wars. During the Pacific War, you have, the people who are Hoklo or Hakka descent. They're 85% of the Taiwanese population. They often have parents that fought as members of the Japanese Imperial Army during World War II and have very different ideas of the Japanese Empire, whereas Chinese migrants that came in with the nationalist regime after 1945 they would have, fought on the Chinese side or the nationalist side in mainland China. They were, they were subjected to a lot of the atrocities committed by members of the Japanese Imperial Army in China, and they have very different views, usually very negative views on Japanese history, right? And also another issue is that during the Japanese colonial period, because of the colonial modernity brought by the Japanese, there is this idea that the Taiwanese movement for self-rule and self-determination came from this period. The Taiwanese elite, the Japanese-speaking Taiwanese elite in this period, and of course, this is widely debated. Like, where's the origins of the Taiwanese identity, right? A group, of scholars in Taiwan, there are historians in Taiwan that thought it's originated from this period, right? And also how the Taiwanese resisted the nationalist rule after 1945, right? And it was these like formerly Japanese-speaking elite, and especially a lot of them were massacred during the early years of the nationalist rule. So because you can see, and again, that massacre that happened in 1947, and also the White Terror period, the nationalist police state, they're extremely important in the TJ process of Taiwan. And now, of course, that's, I know I'm going really quickly and I'm sort of running out of time because I think Alex is popping on. So he's probably going to remind me that, I am already over 15 minutes. So what I'm going to do now is to speed up the process, and and I apologize to the audience because with the amount of information that I prepared, 15 minutes is definitely not enough. So anyway, I'm gonna try to wrap everything up to see if I can do it in the next 5 minutes, so not cutting into too much of the discussion. Now, just to make the long story short, the nationalist period from 1945 to 1992, the nationalist single party dictatorship, as I said, this was the time when the Chiang Kai-shek's government lost the civil war, they moved to Taiwan, and then and also there was this 1 million mainland Chinese who came over with that government, right? And again, they tend to be a little bit pro-nationalist because of this history, and then they're anti-Japanese. So you can see where this this sort of division grows, and the way in which Taiwan democratized 1995 to the present, right? The reason why you have, again, this divided memory politics is, first of all, the Nationalist Party is still in power and as a major political force, and it is supported by a lot of the mainlander population, plus the Hoklo and Hakka and some of the indigenous population that have they were educated by the nationalists, gone over to the nationalist side. So what we usually talk about in Taiwan is that there is, of course, partisanship that's developed after democratization, but then you have what's called the blue and the green. The green were, a Democratic Progressive Party. The party is actually in Taiwan today. They're the ones, and their allied parties and their constituents, they're the ones that are more pro-Taiwan independence, that are they're the ones that are pushing for transitional justice, where you have the nationalists kind of resisting and this is why, part of the reason why the transitional justice process in Taiwan is sort of slow. It is a negotiated path. It is, and I often say that I don't consider, because although a lot of the scholars in Taiwan consider the process to be a failure so far, but I don't look at things that way. I just look at it as this historical past, and also because Taiwan's democratization is not a revolutionary process, but a very long drawn negotiation process, right? So that's why you have these. Now, I'm gonna, I shouldn't really skip this part, but this is but I already mentioned them, right? And it's, so much of Taiwan's TJ process is about sort of redressing the human rights abuses, the police state under the nationalists. So focusing on the initial massacre by the nationalist regime on the Taiwanese, and also the White Terror. And of course, part of the controversy within the TJ process in Taiwan is the legacy of these, the fathers and dictators, Chiang Kai-shek and Chiang Ching-kuo, who rule Taiwan during this period, right? And again, I'm going to really, of course, a lot of these issues will come up, and I'll try to basically get through the last few slides so I can, give you an assessment of the problems and the issues. Now, Taiwan's transitional justice has these characteristics. First of all, it's partisanship. It's basically the Greens pushing the reluctant Blues along, and it has different aspects. One aspect deal with history, education, and museum, and also the Chiang Kai-shek memorial, how we're going to do about the memorials, right? And it's still being debated, right? And also the Nationalist Party assets. And the second is that, like other parts of the world, you have all these social agents, right? And I think in Taiwan in particular, hardworking and keen activist groups formed by scholars, human rights lawyers, victims, and their families in pursuit of justice against usually a very conservative bureaucracy, police, military, and I would say still somewhat lukewarm and suspicious general public. And this is because of the partisan nature of Taiwan's transitional justice. If you're affiliated with a certain political party, or affiliated especially with the blue camp parties, you're going to be suspicious towards these are all for some kind of political purpose. And the other aspect, I think, and the C and D aspect, they're related, right? Because, and this is because, and I mentioned this earlier, the Taiwanese identity and nationalism, right? And transitional justice process in Taiwan is very important. There's this comparative approach, very strong comparative approach to other nations in the world, Germany, South Africa, South Korea, Japan, Spain, because it is related to Taiwan being denied of its de jure statehood internationally. And Taiwan really democratized Taiwan, really tried to show to the rest of the world that it's an open and democratic society that values human rights, social justice, and can collectively reflect on its own past mistake, in contrast to China. It cannot. And so therefore, Taiwanese culture society is less different from China. So what I'm trying to say is that although there's this very strong partisanship and divided memory where people look at, nationalist period differently, the Japanese colonial period differently, and the debate are intense and emotional, but there's not a lot of violence, and there's, less social sort of social inequality in Taiwan. It's all debate on history, but it's extremely intense. But the two sides of the debate has come to some kind of, consensus as well. Whereas, we are Taiwan different from China, but Taiwan ROC or Taiwan, just Taiwan, that's another issue, right? But they have come to some sort of, middle ground, and that middle ground is presenting Taiwan internationally to the rest of the world as a democratic society, as Director Lin, General Director Lin has done so remarkably early on. Now, so this is the last part. I'm sorry it's taking so much time of the assessment of the problem. And of course, the first problem is already mentioned, TJ's delay in its formation and its limitations, right? I already talked about its delay. Limitation was that, it was given limited power and tenure. And I think for me, we need more invested power and permanent status. And second problem really arises from the fact that, the Taiwan's TJ process is, though broadly comparative internationally, but also that led to a critical borrowing of foreign experiences and models. We need to consider cultural and historical specificity and differences and local circumstances. And I think that rings true for our transitional justice process. And also the third thing is accountability. Taiwan's TJ it has been said that Taiwan's TJ is a TJ with only victims and no oppressors. And even with the TJC, it's still, I think to a certain degree, because, because it's very hard for the Taiwanese to talk about responsibility, right? The state was the oppressor, so the state should apologize and make compensation to the victims. And I think both sides of the debate have reached consensus on that. Okay, on compensating the victims and commemorating the victims through museums, through memorials for the 228 victims and the White Terror victims. But what about people running the state, the single party states, right? There's this dispute, and again, this has to do with the dispute legacy of the two dictatorship, and also the history of the Republic of China on Taiwan, right? And of course, with the TJC report, now they have revealed the names of the judges and prosecutors and officials in the national suppressive apparatus. But what to do next? The Taiwanese society has no consensus, as is divided by memory and politics, and less quite ambivalent about assigning responsibility. And this is the last slide. In terms of as a historians, right? So I already mentioned the first one, the inadequacy of transitional justice for indigenous people. And of course, Japanese colonial era historical injustices, state violence, often marginalized in the discussion. And of course, it has to do with the history that I talk about. And I think the most important thing, even for the people who are on the green camp, is to consider the structural continuity between the Japanese and the KMT colonialism when you try to address these injustices, right? And also the diversity of White Terror victims. I'll let Agnes tell you about that because I'm running out of time. And the fourth, still limited and restricted access to official documents that are supposedly declassified. Okay, I know I've taken a lot of time, maybe like 20 or so minutes, or even more. I'm going to shut up now, and I'm going to turn over the mic back to Alex. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you for attempting this impossible task of at least trying to summarize Taiwanese history in 15 minutes. So this is very interesting. This is actually the second time that I'm participating in an event that puts transitional justice in Taiwan, that promotes it to a general audience. And it's very interesting. Last time I participated, the person also started all back in the 17th century or even earlier. Yeah. So just if our audience is confused here, I think this is where you can see that transitional justice in Taiwan is also part of a nation building process. And you try to invent sort of a whole history of Taiwan. Yeah, imagine participating at an event about transitional justice in Germany, and the speaker says, "Oh well, I think we all need to go back all the way to ancient Greece before we start talking about the Holocaust." Yeah, it would be unimaginable. But this is the complicated thing about transitional justice in Taiwan, that everything is sort of related to history and different interpretations and memory and party politics. Yeah, and this makes things very messy. Agnes, I think now it's your time.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen now. Wait. Hold a second. Okay. So can everyone see my presentation properly? Okay, I think it's okay now. So thank you Alex and Dominic for your for your introduction of the TJ in Taiwan. I think Dominic's presentation has already reminded us the uniqueness of the Taiwan's history and the position of Taiwan in the geopolitics in East Asia. As you can see that if you review the whole history of Taiwan, and you can see Taiwan has been a battlefield of different kinds of political forces and different kinds of the wars that happen in East Asia or globally, from colonialism, any kind of civil wars, or many parts of the political intention or forces come to Taiwan. So today I'm going to focus on the post-war. I mean, after the 1945, the end of World War II, what really happened in Taiwan, and in the post-conflict situation. I mean, in after the lift of martial law, or in 1992, then how we recount and we come to terms with our white terror and the Cold War framework in Taiwan, and what's going on with the establishment of the TJC, the Transitional Justice Commission, established in 2018, and now has completed its mission by May of 2022, last month. And what really happened to them, and what are we going to do in the post-TJC era? So when it comes to the transitional justice, I would like to share the idea of reconciliation. As we all know that since the Cold War came to its end, reconciliation has become the most salient goal for TJ while dealing their past sufferings, trauma, shame, and persecution. And we can see, if we want to evaluate what we do and how's our performance about the reconciliation, we can have 4 index to evaluate your work. The first one is truth. Truth is all about establishing a consensus on the past. You can see that Dominic has kept reminding us that Taiwanese society has been suffering from divided politics and divided memory, not only for the post-war era, but also about the colonial time, and also about the Qing dynasty. So to Taiwan, the formerly opposing side reach understanding about who has suffered and who has been continued to suffer. Is very important for Taiwanese society while dealing with reconciliation. And the second was justice. Justice is always focused on the legal process. You know that it's always about the retributive or restorative approaches. But to Taiwan, we always ask the question is who suffered, who was the victim, and who was the perpetrator. So to define and to recognize and to denote who was the perpetrator and what was the perpetration during the white terror in Taiwan becomes the most fundamental issue at the justice aspect. And the third part is acknowledgement, because we all know that without acknowledging the past suffering and the past wounds, the reconciliation cannot be done. And also the fourth part is security. Security is always about if we can reach the goal of reconciliation, then we can secure the democracy and the peace building work in one society. Especially for Taiwan, security is always not only about the peace building, it's always about the national building. I will share more in the later of my presentation. Okay, so where is my, okay. So I want to remind all my audiences that the White Terror was in fact a time of prolonged state of civil war in Taiwan. As Dominic has reminded us that the reason the White Terror would happen in Taiwan was due to the outbreak of the Cold War and also the resume of the civil war between the communist China and the nationalist China, which we know as the KMT regime, happened in mainland. And after 1945, the KMT regime failed to keep their sovereignty in mainland China. So we retreated to Taiwan. And after that, the KMT regime in Taiwan, which means the ROC in Taiwan, therefore established. And during their rule out for 43 years until 1992, ruled by the martial law, and under the martial law, we know as the White Terror, is not only a time of persecution or suffering. It has to be reminded as it was really a time of war, and underpinned by the Cold War framework, which means the most important and the most salient political enemy was communist. And to put it into the situation of Taiwan, we can easily to understand that there would be the PRC, the communist China. So during that time, you can see when the KMT ruled out Taiwan for nearly 4 decades, the regime has to target anyone could be the threat to the dictatorship. So not only the communists, but also people who seek for independence, or anarchists, or people who are really innocent, but without any reason could be targeted as the enemy of the KMT regime. So during that time, you can see that according to the published document, over 22,000 individuals were arrested, imprisoned, or tortured by the KMT regime. And some of them were really left-wing pro-unification, and some of them were really independent seekers or anarchists, and some of them were really had nothing to do with specific political causes or political stance. But after all, during that time, during that time, from the perspective or under the framework of the Cold War, we won't say they were victims during the 1940s to the 1990s. Instead, they were political enemy. But we can easily to discover a turning point of the perspective to these people. It happened in 1979 when the outbreak of the Formosa incident. This incident was initiated by a group of human rights advocates. They tried to commemorate Human Rights Day publicly in Kaohsiung, the southern Taiwan, in 1979, and they were arrested and they were imprisoned, and some of them were really famous, such as Yao Jiawen or Yao Wenjia or Chen Ju. This currently our 监察院长 was one of the convicted ones during the incidents. You can see during that incident, people turned to view these arrested as political victims who suffered, not political enemy. So you can see that the idea of human rights has until then has introduced in the Taiwanese society. So the perspective come to be really dynamic, not really rigid as only a view of war. So I want to talk about more the transitional justice scheme. That the really difficulty for Taiwan was the end of the Cold War, or we say the end of the White Terror, did not really happen by the overthrow of the KMT regime. As we all know that the Deng Hui, who was known as the reformist force, the representative of the reformist force of the KMT, he took over the presidency from Jiang Jingguo in 1988, and he was the one who led the martial law, and also he was the one who known as promote the democratization in Taiwan, and also he was the first president of ROC in Taiwan to officially acknowledge the existence of political victims of the White Terror and the February 22 incident that happened in 1947 in Taiwan. Officially pay his apology to these people and their families. So the Taiwanese society found it difficult to recount the KMT, because it was the KMT themselves automatically to apologize to the victims. But you can see that it is not really happen automatically, because confronted with a gradually strong call for vindication by the victim since the 1980s, as we all know that many people would try to launch the parade for these victims since the early 1980s, started from the Formosa incident. We see that the KMT started to plan a compensation act, a project under Li Denghui's presidency since in 1998. However, this perpetrator launched a TJ plan was compensation, but still no one knows, and no one has been officially named as the perpetrator. So you can see that the end of the Cold War and White Terror did not happen with the cancellation of binary opposition between the capitalism and socialism. All the political stances, especially the PRC, the pro-unification, the left-wing side, still remain as the otherness or the stranger to the idea or the political identity of the political victim. And in 1998, Li Denghui promulgated the Compensation Act. As you can see the article I shared here, only those innocent ones accused of treason and can be compensated or falsely convicted. What does it mean? It means that victims who have to prove they were innocent, they had nothing to do with the post-conviction, the post-accuse, they can be compensated by the government under this presidency. This is weird. As you can see, the idea of political victim becomes really rigid in Taiwan. So the political victim of the White Terror from Li Denghui's presidency until Tsai Ing-wen came to power in 2016, during the nearly 2 decades, we see the political victim show as one-sided, not really multiple, and not really really multi-faces. Only those who recount their past as a time of repression without clear intention or act of subversion were acknowledged by the official transitional justice scheme as a victim or witness to the atrocity of the time. So you can see that the legitimacy of the atrocity under the KMT dictatorship during the White Terror still remain intact. And the Compensation Act, as I shared earlier here, inherited the political legacy of the Cold War. As you can see that only those people who can claim they're innocent, they have nothing to do with the past civil war, the past political conflict, can be compensated by, can restore their reputation from the government in the post-conflict era. This is really rigid situation in Taiwan. But after that, still something good happened. The memory boom of oral history have really grown a lot after Chen Shui-bian came to power in 2000 until 2008. Many of the oral history focus on past persecution and suffering published. However, it's still one-sided, that no one dare to speak of, to voice out their past insurgents and their past dissidents to the public, even to the academia in Taiwan. So who remains guilty, and what's the definition of unqualified victim, and what has been silenced by our official TJ discourse is it forms the center of my doctoral research. But today, because as you know, I work in the public sector in Taipei City government since after I completed my PhD degree in 2018. So I feel like I'm not offering a critique of TJ in Taiwan for now. I'm kind of bringing my reflection on what we have done and what has to be done more and to work more and to put more effort to facilitate the progress of the reconciliation in Taiwan. The 3 photos I share here are part of, they are member of my interviews when I conducted my doctoral research in Taiwan, and some of them have already passed away, but still they offer a lot of voices about their guilt, about not able to speak of their past insurgents with the academia and with the public sphere in Taiwan for now. So what's really going on? You can see that among the survivors of the TJ, among the survivors of the White Terror in Taiwan, these people tend to have a really complicated political identity between the identity of political insurgent and the political victims. The dialectical relations forms as really multiple faces of their personal identity. But somehow you can see that if this scheme facilitated by the sponsored by the government was so rigid, why you join the scheme? Because many of the survivors, the three of my interviews, they joined the government-sponsored TJ scheme very actively. But why? If the scheme was so rigid, then why did they join it? They say claiming their innocence has become a strategy, not merely the outcome of the political situation in Taiwan. What kind of strategy? They try to secure their right to participate in the government-sponsored TJ scheme and also to advocate their current political stance, especially for those who are independent seekers to the citizen in Taiwan. As Dominic has reminded us that the independence stance has become more and more popular, become the mainstream, took a mainstream position in current Taiwan. So you can see that the people who support Taiwan independence, who sees more much more focus than other political stances, and that's part of their strategy to advocate what they are really standing for. And the third part of their strategy is make the claim that the past of persecution still deserve to be disclosed. So you can see that I have to remind you, this is really complicated. I only have not really much time. I have to say that almost every political victim in Taiwan, their political stance is really dynamic, has been really dynamic. No one born to be pro-independence, and no one is born to be pro-unification. People learn and people will change. People will try to tackle, try to develop their own political ideal during their lifetime. It's a lifetime long development of their political stance. So to the political victim. So for now, if they have their own idea, they have their own political belief, they will stand still and to join. Some will choose to join, engage in the official TJ scheme, really actively try to voice out what they are standing for. But for those who are not really fitting with the mainstream discourses in Taiwan, for instance, like the left-wing pro-unification, and people even who are pro-PRC, they might choose to make their own competing TJ discourses outside the official TJ discourse. For instance, that we know as Hu Zhuhui is is one of the most representative associations of victims during the 1950s in Taiwan. They had their autumn worship annually. Every fall, they were trying to commemorate their victims on their own. Their words as they are martyrs, not victims. They are our comrades instead of victims. You can see the difference between the political victims in Taiwan. So Tsai Ing-wen came to power in 2016. She said, "We will discover the truth, heal wounds, and clarify responsibilities." Ironically, that for now, truth, yes, we have truth now. Thanks to the TJC. TJC has done a lot of work, and they work really hard. As you know, that the review encoded over 400,000 pages of political verdicts that related and the related files, and officially published the data, which contains more than 10,000 files. That is officially open to all for now. But somehow they even publish an official research report. Dominic has also mentioned that on decision makers of the political oppression during that time. But what really happened? We cannot find a proper law or proper juridical designation to hold these people accountable. So this is the problem of our current TJ scheme. Although TJC has done a lot of work on truth seeking, still we don't have proper juridical designation to hold these people accountable. And also acknowledgement. I have to say that Tsai Ing-wen has really done a great job on officially and unconditionally vindicated the political victims of the White Terror. But I want to remind you that the people who, if you know Chinese, if you can read Chinese, I really recommend you to check up the Facebook page of the TJC. They published a vindication of the cases, which is known as Li Ma Dou An in Taiwan, a very famous 1950s case, who was a part of the community during that time, and he got a vindication 2 weeks ago, I think, not 2 weeks, so 3 weeks ago, and lot of anger spotted out during the on that page. People just log on the page and share their anger with the vindication. What's really going on? What's really going on? These people were also political victims. But why the Taiwanese society, the voices online, cannot accept it? So you can see that also we found it that the TJC also tried to remove
can I
the
ask
authoritarian
you,
symbol. Sorry?
Can I ask you to conclude in 1 minute?
Oh, can I have 2 minutes?
You can have 2 minutes.
Okay. So we can see that they also try to remove the authoritarian symbols, such as statue or any kind of that can represent the Chiang Kai-shek and Jiang Jingguo, or the idea of the KMT dictatorship. But somehow, very strange things happen. You can see that this woman is Tsai Ing-wen, our president, and this one is my boss, Mayor Ko Wen-je, the mayor of Taipei City, and the former president Ma Ying-jeou, and the former city mayor of Taipei City, Hao Longbing. They stood together, blue to green, and to the one doesn't belong to green or blue, but anyhow, they are all the leading political figures in Taiwan. And why they are standing together? They're standing together for the opening ceremony of the Jiang Jingguo Qihai Cultural Park, who was the houses during his presidency in Taipei. And during the opening ceremony, both Tsai and Ke credits Jiang Jingguo for his cerebral reforms and ending martial law while ignoring his involvement in the White Terror. But I have to say that reconciliation has to happen between perpetrators and the victims, and citizens and the victims. And you can see that the twisted reconciliation in Taiwan has already happened, as both Tsai Ing-wen and Ko Wen-je and other political figures from KMT, they acknowledge the endeavor or the effort on the economic or democratization from Jiang Jingguo. But somehow, during the White Terror, Jiang Jingguo was really special, and he was on the list of the decision maker that published by the TJC, who has to be responsible for the occurrence of the White Terror. So you can see the twisted part has rooted in the Taiwanese society, as that only we people are. I need to say that the cross-strait relations current in Taiwan has shown a great need for Taiwanese society to develop its own political identity. So you can see that even the Cold War era has ended up for nearly 3 decades. Still, the idea of anti-communist has rooted profoundly in Taiwan, not only for the past, for the current political needs of the Taiwanese society. So the reconciliation in Taiwan has still been formulated, shaped, and twisted by the current political need. So the political victim acknowledgement or their security or any juridical designation are still waited to be done, I think, in the post-TJC era. Sorry for wasting your time, and this is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnes, for your presentation. I think we have a lot to unwrap now. So since we are already in the Q&A session, I would like to ask our audience to start typing up their questions in the chat. And in the meantime, I want to ask Dominic a question. Yeah. So we have now talked a lot about all kinds of historical memory complications. I think probably the biggest issue we need to here reconcile with is with the legacy of the ROC. Yeah. So first of all, when we have Agnes' perspective that says there were made, so maybe our idea of the proportion of the victims who participated in resistance against the ROC. Yeah. If our idea is flawed, yeah, depending on that proportion, the ROC has more or less legitimacy for their suppression of dissidents, right? So this is the first sort of question we need to reconcile with. Did the ROC have a legitimacy for their suppression? What is your comment on that?
Yeah, this is, thanks for that question, Alex. And I think this is a very difficult question to answer, right? It really has a lot to do with the reimagining of history and what constitutes Taiwan history, because that legitimacy comes from the will of the people, right? So I would say that, if you look at it because, for blue camp people who, regardless of their ethnicity, are really supportive of ROC history, because in their mind, ROC is tied to the Nationalist Party, and that has its historical legacy evolve, from China. And of course, it takes on a very different format and meaning when it gets to Taiwan, right? But this ROC on Taiwan, the world that is created during the Cold War, was very important for these people and their descendants, or people who really took on this historical memory. Because for them, that's also being Taiwanese, because they live on this island. It was an ROC world, dominated world before democratization. And it's even after democratization, the official name of Taiwan is still called ROC. It's just called ROC Taiwan now, right? So if you look at it from that perspective, you can certainly say, yeah, for a state to defend itself against its enemy, you need to have, in a war situation, there are all these sort of harsh measures that, so this is why, I want our audience to get a sense of that divided memory community, the kind of logic behind it. I'm not trying to say that, people who are supporting, in a sense, they look at the Transitional Justice Project as through a partisan lens, right? Of course, they themselves, people who support the government suppression of these communist people, right? I mean, in their mind, they're not necessarily against the basic principles of human rights, you know, because they know what that is. But they're like, well, in extraordinary time, that's what you need to do. But okay, so that's one side of the debate. But I think on the other hand, you know, especially after Taiwan democratized, there is this sense of, look, you know, that we were ruled by a single party dictatorship, and now we're a democracy, and people back then didn't have a say in the decision-making process, right? If it's a democracy that voted for a government that, you know, and they have basically signed over, you know, the rights, their own civil rights to that government because of the war situation, and you can argue that that is justified, but maybe it's not, because, you know, the nationalist regime from China that migrated to Taiwan, you know, first in 1945, then again in 1949, when the entire government came over, that was, yeah, and I think should be perceived as some sort of, you know, sort of migrant colonial outside force that's imposed on Taiwan, right? And the local people didn't have a say. And so from that perspective, and that's the green perspective, you know, that's, you know, the government have basically no legitimacy at all. It doesn't have local representation, right? And whatever that it did, to the kind of state violence that it did to the people, was not justified. So again, like, I want the audience to see the logic behind these two positions, and they're sort of deadlocking, right? And this is why, you know, transitional justice in Taiwan has been so hard to sort of proceed. Okay, that's what I'm going to say.
Thank you for that answer. Let me follow up with you, Agnes. So you obviously did research on victims who, sort of for their own political or the political needs and interests of their community, chose to disguise that they were, you know, part of some resistance movement during the dictatorship. And you talked about how this developed until 2018. Now, how did the Transitional Justice Commission deal with this issue?
Well, it's interesting that to my knowledge, that in academia, in Taiwanese academia, many researchers have conducted their oral history focus on the past insurgents for over a decade, including myself. But to the TJC, the very first task for them is not for the past insurgents, but for the past atrocities. What really happened from the perspective of the persecution. So you can see that when I share the truth-seeking part under the TJC project, they put really they put a lot of work on what really happened about the persecution and who was the perpetrator, who did this order and who ordered to kill these people, to imprison these people, to arrest these people. But somehow it's still constrained by the perspective of persecution, but not from the perspective of past insurgents. But one thing interesting happened is Tsai Ing-wen really dared to vindicate these past insurgents from the perspective of human rights. From the perspective of human rights, the main reason, according to Tsai Ing-wen's speech, she said that for these political victims, they hadn't been treated right, and they were persecuted. And according to the idea of human rights, this should happen in the past. So they deserve to be vindicated unconditionally, but not to acknowledge what they really support or what they really stand for. So still, this part not only be disguised but also be neglected, I think.
has also been neglected. So I think my take on this is that through issuing all these rehabilitations, and claiming unconditional rehabilitations, this in itself is quite interesting already. This is a strategy to delegitimize the ROC, because it means that the ROC was all imprisoning all those poor and innocent people, and obviously if the proportion of our understanding changes, this legitimacy changes as well. So let me go back to Dominic. When we now go away from sort of the direct victims of the dictatorship to the mainlanders, to the mainlander issue you have researched, did the TJC deal with these mainlanders in their trauma in any way?
I would say yes and no. And this is related to what, the first part of my answer is going to be related to what Agnes just said about the political victims in the 1950s, right? And again, I'll separate my answer into two parts. This first part might, include the mainlanders, but also include these white terror victims who are local Taiwanese, who are just, they're inspired by communist ideology to basically just, overthrow the government through a revolution, right? And I think that part, the people that are, because we have to understand the people actually pushing the TJC or the commemoration of the 228, the restoration, as we already talked about, they basically came from democracy protesters, the green camps, right? I mean, they have difficulty, of course, or even until today, the fact that these people were communist believers, right? I think the job for a historian is to provide a proper explanation into that context. And I think that historians in Taiwan are not doing that. Like for me, if you put me back in that situation in the 1950s, if I were a Japanese educated Taiwanese to live through the nationalist corruption and then the brutal massacre during the 228, the late 40s, I would have been drawn to the communist ideology, right? A lot of them have never been to China. They're just influenced by all these leftist intellectuals, mainlanders, who elites who came to Taiwan and just said to them, like, look, we offer a way to resist. We have organization, and you have comrades that can collab. So for me, that's the only, that's probably, if you're going to stay in Taiwan and not went into exile, it is a very rational choice on their part. Of course, if they've been to China or some of the leftists, left Taiwan and went to China and experienced Cultural Revolution, all of that, right? Their thinking might be very, very different. But for me, that's a way to explain that. And it's for us in this generation to understand that if you're a person, if you're a Taiwanese intellectual in that area, the reason why you're drawn to that ideology and that come to define their lives, of course. And I think it is through that understanding we can do transitional justice through this. So say, okay, it's a very different historical period, it's a very different time. We can explain it. We don't have to hide it. And we don't have to have these political prisoners, because there are historians and sociologists who have done research like this, like Lin Chuan-Kai, and even the last chair of the TJC, Ye Hongling. She wrote this wonderful article in 2015 about how these people were basically just pretend, we're not communist, or they hide the fact they're communist, right? And in order to get compensation from the government, just saying that, okay, because we're innocent, so we should get compensation. So that's part one. That also includes the mainlanders. Part two is, to answer that, it's, two things. One is that, of course, a lot of the mainlanders, of course, the first generation, they're already pretty much, they all pass away now. The second and third generation, they're also a little bit different, right? It really depends on your family. I think the second generation is the most troubled ones. Because they live most of their lives, from the 1950s to the 1980s, right? They experienced the nationalist rule in a way that doesn't really affect them that much, unless you have people who were persecuted by the state, right? And these people are still, a lot of them are still in government, in the civil service. That's the thing, and they have a lot of power to basically obstruct things, and just to, and also in media as well. And so they have basically become this minority of people who have different memories that are so different from the mainstream Taiwanese society. And I think they always feel sort of marginalized, and even this kind of experience of living through democratization is a form of social traumatization for them. I talked about that in my book, and I think it's also very important for the mainstream Taiwanese society to understand that, to acknowledge that, to come up with ways to deal with it, so we can have more successful transitional justice without creating more injustices. And last thing, what I want to say about the mainlanders is it's about the mainlanders in the military. If you look at, and this is widely known, the stats that has been compiled, by the sort of predecessor because before the formation of the TJC, it's really civil groups and advocates, right? Groups like the Truth and Reconciliation, Taiwan's Association for Truth and Reconciliation. And before that, it was the Compensation, Committee for the White Terror victim. They have been compiling the stats of the victims since the mid 1990s or the late 1990s, right? Like among the all known white terror victims, like 45% are mainlanders. And most of them die they were in jail or interrogated, probably from 1949 to 1954. Right? They're all concentrated in that period, right? And they're all and like I said, mainlanders constitute maybe 15%, 13% Taiwanese population. They're 45% of the known white terror victim cases, right? So what's going on? And if you look at it, right, other than these leftist, groups coming from mainland China, intellectuals that we know inspired and organized the local Taiwanese leftists, there's this huge portion that's actually in the military. Now, no one wants to do anything about them. I know Professor Lin Chuan-Kai is coming up with one or two research articles. It hasn't been published. The thing is coming out this year about the military. And these white terror victims in the military, they are not idealists. They just want to go home. There are a huge number of people who are actually kidnapped by the Nationalist Army during the Civil War and brought to Taiwan against their will. And of course, they complain against the government. They want to go home. They can't communicate with homes, right? And some of them on the front line, literally like swim across from Jinmen and Matsu, right? And I look at these files, and a lot of them made attempt, but did not succeed. They were captured and brought back and just executed. And those are all part of the white terror history, right? But again, that's really not explored because it doesn't really fit the current dominant narrative of Taiwan independence, right? And I always thought, I always thought that, the Taiwanese military, so the ROC military, is sort of being pro-KMT, sort of pro-China. Their loyalty is in question. But I think, and I think it's very important to do this history to show that the military, the mainlander-dominated militaries in the 1950s, it is not only an instrument of state oppression, it is also a victim of state oppression. I think it's very important to explore that history as part of the Transitional Justice Project. And also it has meaning towards the military, the serving, the people that are serving in the military now of a different generation saying like, look, this is what the state also did to you, right? And that would certainly put things in perspective. Sorry to go on, but yeah, that will be my answer, a little bit long.
We have now one question from the audience. Yeah, I still encourage the audience to continue typing questions. Maybe I will read it. Yeah, it has to do with truth, so maybe Agnes can answer it. Yeah, how do you think about the connection between finding the truth of our history and transitional justice? Yeah, so is it possible for Taiwanese people to accomplish the goal of transitional justice after reaching the consensus of the stories in the past? Or is it, maybe if I would add, is it even possible at the current state to reach a consensus towards the history of Taiwan?
Well, I would say, sure, it is possible. But one thing I need to remind our audience that the truth is not objective. It is always conditional and political. It is always produced in the journey of power relations. It's always dynamic. That you can see that a version of the truth that the need to secure the sovereignty of the ROC in Taiwan has been prevalent truth in Taiwan, in present-day Taiwan. So any kinds of the discourse or any kinds of political stances that against this discourse or this perspective should be challenged very harsh in our political life. So can we have a chance to finding the consensus of our truth? I think yes. Only we can, we need to hurry up. We need to hurry up to talk, to make these people, these survivors, to talk about their past. We need to finding out. We need to make them voice out what they really been through and what they were thinking about and what they are thinking about. To embrace many kinds of the perspective of the white terror is the only solution to build up the consensus of the truth. Yeah.
I would disagree, actually, because I think it's very difficult to find a consensus during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, they had a political advisor, Jose Zalaquet, from the Chilean Truth Commission. And he said there can be no reconciliation unless there is unless the two main parties have reached a consensus about, a common goal for the future. And I think in the current situation where there's so little consensus between the KMT and the DPP, even attempting to putting out any, kind of consensus would be impossible, because both parties use these historical narratives partly to, attract their voters. Yeah, this is also to mobilize the voters. Yeah, and in this political constellation, it's very difficult to find common ground unless they cannot agree on a common goal. Yeah.
But for Taiwan, one thing is different, that you can see that the KMT is not so influential compared to their past time after 2008 in Taiwan. Not only DPP, I'm talking about if the society has already a consensus about we are going to do our national building, about to talk about the Taiwan, what kind of nation we are going to build up in the name of the ROC in current Taiwan, then is there any possibility for us to embrace our, different kinds of the past, the different faces of the past? Yes, I will agree with you partially, as this is really difficult and really challenging. But, I work in the public sector. I have to keep my faith and keep optimistic about the future. Otherwise, I would cry every day.
This is also part of your job. Okay. And we have another question from Heather, actually. So you spoke earlier about memorialization. Is there an acceptance of creating memorials and those that have been erected? Are they accepted and recognized as part of memory and reconciliation? So maybe the Urba Memorial, I guess?
Or you mean 松正纪念堂, Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall.
Yeah, we haven't talked
Is
about
a
Chiang
kind
Kai-shek
of
Memorial Hall yet.
Yeah. Well, Dominic, do you have any ideas? To me,
Yeah,
this is
yeah. Okay, go ahead.
this is a really challenging question, as you know that we are still in the very preliminary stage about what kind of memorial and what kind of commemoration of the White Terror we are going to have. Yeah. So, okay,
Yeah,
Dominic,
let me jump
yeah.
in now. I will like to speak on two things. And of course, first is to Heather's question about commemoration and memorialization related to transitional justice and white terror and national state violence, right? I mean, there are definitely a lot of sides. The other thing is about reconciliation. Is the possibility of reconciliation. Of course, this is in response to the discussion of Alex and Annex earlier. Now, of course, these two issues are related, right? First of all, in terms of the issue of commemoration, what you have in Taiwan now is a very interesting situation where, different memories can coexist, right? You have the 228 memorials, the one that run by the city government in Taipei, and the national one in South Central Taiwan, Jiayi, and you have all other smaller museums, right? And of course, you have the National Human Rights Museum, right? The prison side, Green Island, basically just had held all the political prisoners, and the Jingmei side in Taipei, which was also a place where they held the political prisoners when they're waiting on trial, but you also incarcerated, right? And you have all these sites. But then also within Taipei, you'll still have this giant Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall over there. So I was, foreign visitors to Taiwan sometimes really, they were amazed, right? I was in an event held by TJC, and this was just a couple months ago, in November 2021, and that event is about discussion of what to do with Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall, right? Because it was a huge problem for them. Would you basically remove the entire thing, or just remove Chiang Kai-shek's giant statue that's in there, that's sitting like Lincoln in Washington? I mean, that literally that huge statue was designed that way, right, to show how great of a man that he is. And so they and what struck me in that was that when they invited representative from the victim's family, in a case this person was a real victim, he was put in jail by Chiang Kai-shek. He said that my heart dripped blood every time I walk by Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall, sitting that it's still there, right? Although, yeah, you have the 228 Memorial, you have all these things that we receive state compensation, but the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial is still there. And when and this victim, former victim, he was working for he was, because TJC is already gone, like it was already over. And he was, sometimes had to receive a lot of, because they do, like I said, that's part of my talk. They do a lot of international liaison exchange. So he had hosted people from South Africa, from Germany, from former East Germany, right? Also formed by their lawyers, as social activists and historians. And then he had to basically, took them on a tour of Taiwan. So this is the Human Rights Museum, and I'll take you to the sites where they where they bury all the political prisoners after they're executed in Liuzhangli. And then that's in the morning. In the afternoon, they were taken on this other sightseeing tour to see Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall. So this really blew especially the Germans, it blew their minds away. They're like, what? This Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall is still here? It's like kind of like Adolf Hitler's memorial still, or statue still sitting in the middle of Berlin. What's going on here, right? So that's just to answer Heather's question, right? This really shows you And then of course, Chiang Kai-shek statues, that was another issue because there used to be like 45,000 of them all across the island, right? Now most of them were removed, and 200 or 300 were moved into this statue park in Taoyuan. It's called the Two Chunks Cultural Park. That was right beside Chiang Kai-shek's mausoleum. And in that mausoleum, the Taiwanese state still paid money to maintain that mausoleum with 24/7, maybe not 24/7, but at least guard service during the day. I mean, from the Taiwanese military paying tribute to was a tourist attraction, but that's the thing. Now, so this really goes to show you that, and my argument is that, of course, people are going to look at this and say, well, Taiwan's TJ is basically a failure, right? If you can't just change Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall or just remove it or just rename it, but the square outside was renamed the Liberty Square, right? In the late 2000s, I think. And that was through this sort of negotiation between the two political forces, the blue and the greens, or two memory groups, right? And people always ask me, what about the middle ground party, right? It's like, Agnes Boss, that he came to a political scene through that middle of the road. I would say, yeah, maybe middle of the road is a really, good idea when people getting sick and tired of all these political infighting. But still, even people who claim themselves to be middle of the road politically would have an opinion on the ROC legacy, on the nationalist, they'll have an opinion on the legacy of Chiang Kai-shek and his son Jiang Jingguo. And you can just tell. So people can vote different politically, but they will take a stand on these historical issues, and that's divided memory community in Taiwan. Now, lastly, about reconciliation, I think, when I was in Taiwan a couple of months ago, I gave a number of talks where I try to basically, push several of Michael Rosber's. So Michael Rosber is, he is a scholar of literature. Of course, he specialized in Holocaust studies, and he has few ideas. One is multi-directional memory. The other one is implicated subjects. Okay, I'm not, I think it would take too long for me to explain this, but I will just focus on it, because multi-directional memory is about, all these different memories that are actually related to one another. They're not unrelated, right? It's just that different perspective, for people that are in these memory group to find a way for them to connect and resonate with one another on a serious and emotional level. That's where you can get reconciliation. The other important idea is implicated subjects, right? And implicated subject is especially important for people of the post-memory generation, defined by Marion Hirsch, right? People who didn't live through that period, people who are not really political prisoners. They're basically just people who born after, right? They have to feel that they're implicated. So implicated is not culpability. It's not in a legal sense. It's some kind of moral and ethical responsibility, right? And to understand your relationship with the system of oppression that exists before and also still to a certain degree after democratization. And I think for me, although, so my view is that until you get these ideas, you might need some sort of consensus on history. You will never have any consensus on history. But if you get people to receive these ideas and they became important, just like, their recognition or acknowledgement of the human rights values or the values of democracy, that plus things like implicated subjects or multi-directional memory, you are going to have more successful TJ process, the ones that truly comes from the grassroots. So that's my stance on this. Of course, people have called me an idealist. People have called me, yeah, you can't get people to do that. Yeah, it's hard. it's hard. But you first of all, you need to promote the idea and let people understand it first. But I would admit that I haven't done enough, talk, and I don't have enough influence, and people just look at me right now like I'm these communist idealists and intellectuals in the 1950s. You're fighting a fight that is really hopeless. but like I said, I'm not comparing myself to them, right? Because they're putting their lives on the line, for crying out loud, and I'm not. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say.
Thank you for that elaborate answer. Just maybe one sentence about memorialization and the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall. So while there's obviously a lot of valid criticism towards the TJC, I have a bit of sort of pity for them, because at the beginning there was this plan to restructure the whole Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall, and then the DPP actually stepped in and said, no, this is creating too much tension, let's not touch it. And this brought the TJC into a situation when they would change it, they were accused of splitting the society. When they were not changing it, they were accused of continuing dictator worship. And when they said we need more dialogue, they were accused of just promoting empty talk. So I think the TJC was at some point also put in a situation where it could have not done anything right. So this is the difficulty of memorialization when it comes to these statues of the dictatorship. Okay, thank you very much. We are 10 minutes over time. This did not develop the way I thought it would develop. We had now very long presentations, but anyway. And I think our audience in the future for the next few sessions will have some kind of, historical background about the messiness of Taiwanese memory politics. Next week, we're going to talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. We have 3 very interesting speakers. And I'm going sort of to try during the questions to juxtapose how some Taiwanese scholars, what conclusions and what sort of their research findings on the South African TRC, and whether their research findings are in line with South African experts and sort of their assessment of the TRC. That would be it for today. I thank everyone, all of our participants, for listening, and I hope to see many of our participants of today next week again. Thank you so much. And obviously, I also thank our 2 speakers for preparing these monstrous presentations and still trying to manage to squeeze them in our very limited framework.
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Are we gonna, Alex, are we gonna stay for a while to talk things over, or this is it?
I think we can stay here. It's fine. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the